This September, we're very much restarting our year, and that's typical of church as well as academic and schools. It's the start of a year for us, and we're actually beginning our year with a short series called Centre Church, which is looking at a little bit about who we are, what is our calling. And I believe that churches belong to God. Jesus is the head of the church, and that churches are raised up by him for his purpose and his mission and ministry. And it's really helpful for churches to ask themselves the question, what has God called us to, and are we being faithful to our call? And for many people, when we think about church, we think about a church that serves a parish, that serves a community, that serves a geographically defined community, and it interacts with that community very closely. But churches come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and certainly for Woodlands, we are a local church, and I'm local to church. I walk to church usually, and it's great to feel a presence in the neighbourhood. But we're much more than a local church. Actually, we're also a gathered church. We're a church in the city. We're a church that people relate to not just as a local church, but as a place of influence, or a place that they have some sort of connection with that's a bit different from local church. And part of what we're trying to do as we think about this little series is think, who are we? What are we called to be? What's God doing with us? And how can we cooperate with his plan and purpose for us? And today we're thinking about worship and what it means to be a worship centre. And before I really launch into what it means to be a worship centre, I'm going to ask Kos Leung to come and talk a little bit about worship. And I particularly want to mark a little bit of a transition with Kos as well. So most of you here, unless you're a visitor, will know Kos. And many of you will aware, but many not as well, that over the summer there's been a bit of a journey for Kos in terms of thinking what next. Because Kos is someone who's wanted to keep growing as a person, as a minister, and over the last year or so, within the worship team, of which Kos is very much a vibrant part, there's been a transition of responsibilities. And so now April Ballard, actually, why don't you come up as well, April? April has taken on that kind of the mantle that for a number of years Kos has carried as worship pastor. And though Kos is still working and worshipping and being involved in comms, very much that's been a transition. But Kos was considering very carefully moving to Hong Kong this summer. And there was an approach from a church in Hong Kong about, would you like to come and work with us? And Kos has got parents in Hong Kong, and there were all kinds of reasons which meant it felt like a really good thing to explore. But having explored it very thoroughly and been over and led worship in this big church in Hong Kong, Kos actually felt, actually, no, this doesn't feel right. And Bristol. So this is a chance for me not only to say, oh, that's a relief, but but also to kind of mark something which has been happening in terms of that transition. But as we go into worship, I'd love, first of all, Coach, just to share a little bit about what it means for him to be part of a worshipping church as a worshipper.
Cool, thank you. I normally hide behind a guitar, and I don't often speak. And I also went to the wedding that Dave mentioned, so I've had to write things down. So bear with me. So I've been part of this church for 23 years. I know, I look young, don't I? And pretty much for most of that time, I've been in and involved around worship, so either with the sound team or kind of helping out with the band stuff and all that sort of thing. But for the last 12 years, I have been serving as worship pastor, and I'm very, very excited about handing that stuff over to April. She's a great friend. I trust her, and actually, any kind of grace and favour that you've given me, please give her loads on that as well. But in that time, I guess I've had the privilege and honour to be with you and worship with you through times of joy and also times of sorrow. And through all of that, I guess I've had my good days and I've had my bad days, so thank you for bearing with me in all of that. But I am really thankful that worship in this place has always been a place about God's grace and about God's mercy. And worship is a place where we've seen hope and healing happen and all the good stuff that God has for us. But I guess in its simplest form, we've seen God's love expressed and made real through care and concern and notice, and through our songs and how we try to live out our lives. I've lost my place. So worship is a place where, in fact, hopefully we all experience something of God's love and care as individuals, but as we gather as a group as well. Not because we've earned it, but primarily because of God's great generosity to us all. So we love because he first loved us. That's great, isn't it? So as we gather on Sundays and in between to seek more of that love and generosity from God, to find ways to live, worship, and mirror what we have been given, and to be a bunch of people who then live out and give out of that generosity. We welcome in, but we also reach out. Because when we worship, we can't help but be connected directly to the very heart of God. So we love who he loves, and we ache where he aches. So Romans 12 talks about celebrating with those that celebrate and mourning with those who mourn. And that is about the breadth and spread of things, but it's also about that spirit and truth. It's about the tension that's in the room right now. That actually, on any given Sunday when we gather, we are a mix of people, both celebrating and mourning, but ultimately people seeking out God's grace together. So, motivated by that grace and a God who loved us first, we visit the mountaintops so we can care in the valleys, inside and outside of church. And I'm afraid it is a case of both and. So our worship and identity isn't separate to our missional one. They are one and the same. And in John 12, verse 32, it says, "When I am lifted up from earth, I will draw people to myself." And that was very much my own experience. As somebody who didn't know anything about God, I came into a place where heartfelt worship was really happening. And God became so real and so obvious. And it wasn't like a fancy preach or a convincing X, Y, and Z. It was just the reality of the presence of God. And in fact, over the years, people have been kind of like wandering past the church, or, you know, you've invited friends and families to this place who maybe don't know anything about church, and they've experienced something of God in this room, right? That's been amazing. So, yes, we are a worshiping centre to which we gather, but we're also a worshiping centre from which we go. To find ways to tell and show people that we love because he loved us first.
Thank you, Kay, so much. Let's just give Kay a little round of applause. Grace, I know you like to worship in spirit and truth, so I thought I'd give you that. Very important. And I wonder actually, Grace, whether you'd pray with me for April. She kind of just acknowledge that. Hopefully you won't notice a difference. I think I can't see any difference. He's worship leading and he's around, but there's some changes in role, and we want to really bless what God's doing in these guys.
Lord, we thank you for April and her heart to worship you and to see your kingdom extended, to see lives changed. And Lord, right now, actually, it's not a new thing. It's a call that you've put on her heart for so long. Lord, I pray for grace and favor and a closeness and a proximity to you, and a wisdom that allows her to discern and lead in the things that you set before her, and in service to this church and community. Lord, give her humility, which she already has, Lord, and a love, such a deeper love for people. But primarily, Lord, a heart that chases after you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, guys. Well, we're going to let you go, but I guess if you're a visitor today and you're so welcome, and it may well be that you found we're a little bit in-house. You know, we've done some things to do with us as a community, and so apologies really if that's taken a bit of time and you've not been able to quite connect with all of that, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of a flavour of the people that we are, because who we are is far more than a Sunday service. It's about a 24/7 life that is really connected. So that's just a little window into some of that. But we are going to think a bit about worship right now. And I'm going to read to you from Matthew's Gospel. And I'm going to read to you from Matthew chapter 8, which says this. It's a story that's based in the temptation sequences of Jesus in the wilderness. And in verse 8 it says, "The devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kings of the world and all their splendor. 'All this I will give you,' he said, 'if you will bow down and worship me.' And Jesus said to him, 'Away from me, Satan, for it's written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only.' Then the devil left him and angels came and attended him." If you're going to walk around Bristol today and do a little survey of what you think the big issues are for our city, you might find all kinds of answers. You might find it's about the arena, or you might find it's about housing, or you might find it's about education, or a whole range of things you might feel that people talk about, the issues that define us and that are battlegrounds. But not many people would say to you, the real issue for Bristol is how people worship and who they worship. But I just want to suggest that as far as God's concerned, and as far as the ultimate realities of the unseen world, who we worship and how we worship are the biggest questions and the biggest battles that we have to fight. And here we have a little picture that is an encapsulation of so much of the story of the Bible. The story of the Bible is very much about who do you worship? Do you worship the Creator God who made it all? Or do you run after other things? And here we see a battle for worship. And I believe that battle for worship has not gone away. That there still is a battle for worship. And if there is a battle for worship, it begs the question, well, what is worship anyway? And I'm going to offer you one definition of worship, which is simply this. Worship is what you give yourselves to. Worship is what you give yourself to, who you give yourself to. Yesterday, I had the privilege of taking the marriage of Matt Legbag, now known as Matt George. And he was, as he reflected at the wedding, his wife works in the NHS, and in the NHS, a leg bag is something very particular. And so they decided to change their name by default. So that's Matt George and married to Ali Watson. And so Matt and Ali made their vows to one another. The old version of the marriage service says, "With my body I thee worship." There's a sense in which, as I give myself to someone in marriage, it's worship, because worship is who we give ourselves to, what we give ourselves to. And we all give ourselves to things, don't we? And it's not wrong to give ourselves to things. The issue around worship and the battle for worship isn't whether we give ourselves to things, but who do we give ourselves to supremely? What's the first gift, the first loyalty in our lives? And for Matt and Ali, as they made their marriage vows to one another, their marriage was in church because it was under a higher loyalty, a loyalty to God that said, we have given ourselves to him first and foremost, and out of our giving to him, we give ourselves to one another. And we give ourselves to all kinds of stuff in life. Some people give themselves to sport. In my house, there's a lot of sport interest. There's a lot of talk about football, and people have given themselves to some degree or other to various football teams. I'm not a very serious follower of football, which is a good job because Arsenal is my team of choice. But there are people who give themselves, and you see the torture that they go through, and the highs and lows. If you're a Man United supporter, as is my son Ben over there, it's not been a great week. That's it. Anyway, so or whatever, or we give ourselves to our families, and what we give ourselves to, we tend to talk about. So we give ourselves to sport, we talk about sport. We give ourselves to family, we talk about our families, our kids, our partners. We give ourselves to business, to money. We talk about that kind of stuff. We give ourselves to sex. We talk about that. We drop sexual innuendos, whatever it is. It tends to be that what we worship comes out in our lifestyle, in our words and our actions. What do we give ourselves to? And whether or not things are constructive or destructive depends on what they sit under. So to be honest, most of the things that we love and give ourselves to, they're okay if they're under a higher love. But if they are if they take the place of God, then they so often become destructive. So worship is what we give ourselves to. And if we give ourselves first and foremost to God, everything in our life is permeated by that worship. Our sex lives, our sporting lives, our business lives, our family lives are wonderful and glorious because they're permeated by that thing. But if not, they may become demons, in the words of C.S. Lewis. So there's a spiritual battle around worship. And churches are all worship centers. But in the Bible, there are different models of what worship centers are like. And so let me show you the first slide that I've got on my PowerPoint. And this is the model of temple. Now, in the Bible, the king of Israel, King David, wanted to create a house for God. He said, he conquered Jerusalem. It was the center of the nation. And he built himself a palace. And he thought, God, you're the center of the nation, really. You're the true king. I'm just under you. And you should have a house here. And God said, well, you're a man of blood. You mustn't build it. But your son Solomon, he's going to build the temple. And actually, that's what Solomon did. It picked up from the tabernacle, the place of worship that preceded the temple. And Solomon built this amazing, costly, lavish building in Jerusalem, which is a city on a hill. And at the heart of the city on a hill is a temple. And today, the temple site, is a place of pilgrimage for people around the world, isn't it? A city on a hill with a place of worship that gives a sense of incredible significance because this is a house for God. And what it says is by having this visible place of worship, it means that this nation belongs to God. And when we come to the temple, we come in festivity and celebration. We gather as a nation for big acts and times of worship. And this is a place of sacrifice. This is a place where we make our offerings to God. And that's what temple worship was. And today in the church, our equivalent of temple probably is cathedral. We have a big visible building at the heart of a city that says, we're a nation and a community, a city that worships God. And when we go into cathedral, our prime experience should be of transcendence. How great is our God? And the building is designed to call out our ideas of how great God is and how worthy of worship is. It's kind of like, God, you've got a house in the city. And it's a temple. And that is a model that we have. But in the New Testament, Paul talks about worship, and he says that temple has been transcended by you being the place where God dwells, you being the house for God, and therefore, when you worship, what does sacrifice mean? Romans 12, verse 1. Offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. So, as a worship center, when we come together to worship, we are still coming for God. And the sacrifice is, well, we're going to give ourselves. What can we give to God? What does God want? God is looking for worship. Jesus, when he talks to the woman at the well in John chapter 4, says, the Father is seeking true worshippers who will worship him in spirit and truth, worshippers with integrity. Because God isn't interested in the form. He's not interested in the outward. He's interested in the inward. He's interested in the heart that comes for. And what pleases God when we come to worship isn't how amazing the worship music is, but what our heart is saying. And particularly, are we re-covenanting, re-giving ourselves to God? And so, as a worship center, a house for God, we want to invite people to come and give themselves to him, reconsecrate themselves to him. And say, this is for you. And if that's true, then it doesn't matter too much whether we even aesthetically enjoy the worship form, because that's superficial. When Jesus was debating with the woman at the well, they had a debate a little bit. She said, well, some say you should worship this way at Mount Gerizim. You Jews say we should worship in Jerusalem. Jesus said, look, that's not the big deal. It's not the outward form. The Father is seeking true worshippers, worship in spirit and truth. And that's the heart. So the heart of worship is the key. How do we come today to worship? Have we come to offer God our offering of ourselves? And we will use whatever's on offer to do that. We may not like that song, we may do, but we can still use that. We may not like that liturgy, we might not like that, whatever it is. We may not like that preacher. But whatever it is, we'll use because it's for him. It's not about me, actually. It's about him. So let me say, a worship center is about him. And a visible worship center, it elevates God. In the temple, they put time and money into worship resource because they wanted to give the nation a great worship experience and to elevate their view of who God was. And to be honest, we give time and energy to worship teams, and we spend money on equipment and all that kind of things. We want people to have a great worship experience and have an elevated picture of God, to come out with a bigger vision of God than they came in with. And music and song is a vehicle for self-giving. It always has been. throughout human history, throughout human culture. So music does have a part in our worship. It's not the only part, but it's there. But this is a worship centre. And really, to be honest, people see Woodlands as a worshipping church. It has a reputation as a worshipping church. The preaching may be a bit naff, but they can worship, people say. They do. They say that, don't they? Perhaps. I think they might do. And people come and visit us for a worship time. You know, Sunday night in particular, where we are very much, there aren't that many worship services in the city on a Sunday evening. People come. I discovered that a whole bunch of teenagers were coming from Redland Parish Church, because they wanted to come to worship. Other bunch of teenagers travelling over from Down End and thinking, I want to come and have a worship experience. This helps me to worship. This helps me to connect with God. Strangers, every Sunday, there will be visitors in our midst on a Sunday night and here on a Sunday morning. I want to say you're welcome, because it's for you, actually. It is part of what we want to be to the city. We want to create a worship resource that blesses the city. And part of that is to encourage and stimulate creativity in worship, songwriting, all as varied an expression of worship as we can. And if you tune into Woody's worship group, or Matt, who's leading worship today, and others have been pioneering a worship album that's being recorded, because we want to offer something that will help people have that big view of God, because it's for Him. Does that make sense? Second picture of worship in the Bible is the church in the community. And for the Jewish people, when the temple was destroyed, and before the temple was destroyed, when the Jewish people were in exile and dispersed, they continued to worship, but they worshipped in community. And their communities were called synagogues. And where you had a group of 12 Jewish guys, you could have a gathering. And we have that equivalent. We call it the local church. And let's just put a slide up there. And there we've got an old synagogue from Roman times there. And here's the little church. And the thing that synagogue did when the church was under pressure, when we didn't have a temple we could go to, was it kept the faith of believers alive. And for worship, if the temple, the motif of temple worship is sacrifice, the motif of community worship is Sabbath. It's that regular weekly worship where the believers gather to pass on the faith to their children, to remind themselves of what they believe, to study the Torah, to express their commitment, to grow in their discipleship, to be a community that sustains itself in worship, because it's a house for believers. And I said that worship wasn't for us, it was for God. But worship is also for us, it's for believers. To come to worship is so that we might experience the benefits of being refreshed in our faith, to grow in our faith, and have the fellowship of being with one another. And a congregation is a great size to meet in. And here at Woody's, we do that both in diverse services. Our 8 o'clock service this morning, I was down there. It really feels like congregation. We don't expect visitors to show up. I said to those people, the reason you're here at 8 o'clock is because you're a worshipper. I mean, you're not here primarily for the breakfast. You're not here because you fancy somebody. Those are reasons that people do come to church, by the way. But you're here because you're a worshipper, or you're here because your mum and dad made you come. But you're here primarily because you're a worshipper. You've got up early because you come into worship, but we're sustained in that worship by being community. And actually, it's mainly about us. And that's valid. And that weekly rhythm, the Sabbath, I think is important. I'm a believer in committing yourself to a church community and coming every week, to be honest. I think it's that 1 day in 7 is a kind of rhythm I need to sustain myself. I need it in my marriage. I need a date night every week. Otherwise, things go off the boil a little bit. We lose a little bit of intimacy and fellowship and friendship. We can let resentments build up. I need. That's my basic minimum with God. 1 day a week. It's my basic minimum to come and worship, I think. And I think Sabbath is there for a purpose. But then we also find another picture of worshiping community in the New Testament, and this is the church in the home. And where's that little slide there? And you know that the early church, they did meet in large gatherings. In Acts 2, they're there in the temple courts, and that's the only place you could get 3,000 people in, which is the number added to the church on the day of Pentecost. And they did continue to meet in synagogue, and Paul that was the first place Paul would go to on his mission trips, because that's, I'm gathering around community. But we also read that they met day to day in home. And the motif of church in the home is salvation, because the church in the home is the center for the outreach and growth of the early church. House churches planted all over the Roman world. And we actually want, as a worship centre, not just to be a worship centre, but to see house churches planted all over our cities. We call them home groups and pastorates. We hope that there'll be places that are bespoke, places where there can be that place not just for God, it's a house for God, because we're a house for God. Not just for believers, because we're a house for believers for sure, but also a house for seekers. Let's put my final slide up. Worship, the place of the church, is a house for God, a house for believers, and a house for seekers. And the reason we know that is 1 Corinthians 14. Paul's talking to the church. He's talking to a typical church. 1 Corinthians 14 is probably the worship, those verses, the chapters at the end of Corinthians, 11, 12, 13, 14. They're about worship, actually. They're a great little manual of how worship probably happened in early church. And it might look a bit different from ours, but one thing that you're clear is that Paul expected worship to be a house for God. The presence of God. Where 2 or 3 gather in my name, Jesus said, I'm there in the midst of them. And he expected to be a house for believers where we build one another up. But he expected also to be a house for seekers, for unchurched people. In 1 Corinthians 14, Paul is writing to the church, and they love to speak in tongues. Not many of you love to speak in tongues. Some of you do. But lots of you think, that's a bit weird. I'm not sure that's for me. And some of you may never have done that. We could do a little straw poll, but we won't. But in the early church, one of the gifts of the Spirit they really celebrated was the gift of tongues. And they felt they were really built up by that. But Paul says to them, look, I know you like worshipping that way. When you've got seekers present, don't do it. Because they're going to think you are crazy. And they will just feel alienated. They won't understand. And what he did say was, if you prophesy, if you bring the revelation of God, their hearts will be convicted and they will fall on their knees and say, God really is among you. And you see the three thoughts, that God is here, it's his house. You're here, you're the community that we can belong to. But we're here as seekers and you've made it welcome for us. And for me, my heart for Woodies as a worship centre is that we prioritise worship because I believe the presence of God can be found in worship. And my heart is that we prioritise worship because I want a testimony that God has followers and that he's worth worshipping. And I want it to be a city on a hill. I want it to be visible enough that people can know that God has not abandoned Bristol and that his people are here. You know, isn't it depressing when you see churches turned into warehouses or pulled down or whatever? You think, and what's that message saying to our culture? Oh, the tide's gone out. Faith isn't here anymore. God doesn't have any friends anymore. So it's great to be able to reopen a church building as a place of worship. But the key is you and worship us here. And that we can be visible enough that people who are strangers can walk in. And that the integrity of worship is it's not just some great music or not just some inspirational words or not just even a powerful prayer. But I can tell that there's something going on here because God is in the midst and he's in the hearts and minds and words of people who are worshipping. And that worship spills out into the lives that we live. And we're gossiping about Jesus because he's our number one loyalty, because we can't get enough of him, because all our other loves are sitting under that higher love. And when I play football, I'm a worshipper. Whatever it is. So we're going to have communion now, you know, and if there's ever a place that symbolized those three things, it's communion, because in communion is a place of sacrifice where we covenant ourselves back to God. In the Old Testament, worship was very covenantal. There's a sacrifice that's made to express two parties in a relationship. And here the parties are God and us. And God has given us Jesus to be our living, to be our sacrifice, to make it possible for us to know him. And in communion, when we take the bread and wine, we give ourselves back to Jesus. So it's a house for God. But it's also a house for believers, because when we take communion, it's not just considering the body of Christ and thinking what he's done for us. It's also thinking that we are the body of Christ and there should not be divisions among us. And it's a place for restoration of fellowship and commitment to one another. And we are the community that are bound together. We who are many are one because we all share in the one loaf, as Paul writes. So it's a house for believers. But it's also a house for seekers, because when we eat the bread and drink the wine, We proclaim his death until he comes, Paul writes. And so actually today, if you're a seeker particularly, what we're doing when we have communion is we're acting out the gospel. In a few moments, we're going to say a declaration. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. That's a condensation of the gospel. When we say that, Christ has died, what does that mean? It means that we who were held by powers too strong for us, powers of sin and evil within and without us, that we could not be free from, and that we could not approach a holy God, that Jesus' death on the cross has set us free from those things. So he's died, and that's good news for us. That means we can now belong to God, and we can now do that worship, which is giving ourselves to him who gave himself for us. So my worship is I give myself to you, God, and you can make your home in me by your Spirit. So I am now at a place of worship, a temple. So Christ has died. Christ is risen. Those powers have set us free, and Jesus is head of the church, and Christ will come again. And until that time, our job is to tell everybody the good news about Jesus and invite them to know and belong to him and to know the blessing of the living God.